In the 1993 film Fearless, Max escapes mostly unscathed from a plane crash. This makes him a subject of public interest due to the catastrophe itself and his role as hero in the event. Max spends time trying to ease the pain of a woman named Carla, but begins to unravel as his family has trouble adjusting to the new, enlightened version of himself. Following the plane crash, Max becomes a new man. He previously had a fear of flying, but even immediately after the crash, he is perfectly comfortable getting on another flight to go home. He's no longer afraid of death, and he waxes philosophical about this. Max and Carla go to church, and they ruminate on the existence of God and why people believe or don't believe. This is the most the movie attempts at searching for answers, though. Max broaches the subject about not fearing death, but he does not actually explain why, and even in the most rudimentary of ways. With this in mind, I will try to give some basic philosophical context to Max's new outlook on life and his feelings on the fear of death. Defining death remains a challenging prospect in and of itself, but with the counterpart of defining life, it becomes even more complex. Imagine we construct a being that has all the hallmarks of life and psychological attributes that one ascribes to a person. Is this being alive? Does this being have a life? Well, what we consider death is also ambiguous. This event might be understood in three ways, all defined by The Philosophy of Death by Stephen Looper. First, it might be the ending of the dying process, meaning the loss of the very last trace of life. We might call this the denouement, death. Second, it might be the point in the dying process when extinction is assured, even if there is some trace of us left. We might call this moment threshold death. Third, life ends when the physiological systems of the body have lost the capacity to function as an integrated whole, or when this loss becomes irreversible. We might call this integration death. These definitions may seem obtuse when defining. Dead is dead, some might say. But even outside of philosophical circles, people are considered clinically dead or medically dead if they lose all blood circulation and breathing, but are able to be revived before brain death. In Fearless, Max has a violent allergic reaction to strawberries and stops breathing. Is he dead during this time? Until his wife revives him with CPR, is he somehow not alive? Throughout much of the film, Max denies any fear of death, dismissing it as an inevitability and therefore not worth his concern or any form of planning. Max takes the perspective of Socrates. The film does not reference this philosopher, but I will. Socrates believed death was nothing to fear because of the two possibilities he could conceive of, nothingness or an afterlife, neither of which was undesirable to him. Nothingness following death is sometimes called termination thesis, and something existing past our extinction is sometimes called the dead survivor thesis. Socrates claimed that if the former is true, nothing can hurt him while dead, and if the latter is true, he can potentially interact with other dead survivors. In some philosophical circles, fearing death is logically excluded by explaining that one can never experience death. One can certainly experience dying, but one cannot experience the state of being dead. If we conclude that death happens after the irreversible loss of any trace of us, the aforementioned denouement, death, then death is never in the same place at the same time as ourselves. We can't feel being dead after we die. In the film, Max remarks that because he faced death on the plane, he himself is dead in a manner of speaking. But this does not actually meet any of the criteria for death. He has never faced death because nobody faces death. In the termination thesis, death only exists after the conclusion of our existence. Death and life cannot share the same space. Another method of dismissing death as a negative is called the symmetry argument, meaning it is irrational to object to death since we do not object to pre-vital non-existence. This means that we do not object to the state of non-existence that preceded our lives, and the two are alike in all relevant respects, which means any objection to the one would apply to the other. This gives comfort to those who fear death by attempting to explain it away with the simplest of equations. But this basic math does not take into account death as it relates to comparativism. Philosophers reminding people not to fear death is fruitless if those people believe in the harm thesis. Typically, those who value life accept this thesis that death is a negative for those who die. Some things and events are intrinsically good or bad for a subject, but some things and events are extrinsically good or bad for a subject, meaning because of the contingent effects. They are good or bad by comparison. Regardless of the fact that life and death cannot exist in the same place at the same time, that does not preclude avoiding death and fearing death on the basis of appreciating life. Also, the symmetry argument does not take into account that our pre-existence is something that has already passed and therefore cannot be feared as something that is coming. Toward the end of the film, Max enthusiastically declares that he is alive, accepting comparativism and the harm thesis. But would Max want to live forever if he had that choice? If we lived forever and death did not exist, we might lose the desires with which we identify. Life might lose its novelty, and boredom would set in, and that boredom would last forever. The extremely old would have to replace their fundamental desires so often that eventually the person we once were would functionally no longer exist, which some would argue is tantamount to death. Following the plane crash, Max becomes an almost entirely new person. Before, he was fearful and worrisome. Following the catastrophe, he is seen as nearly unrecognizable even to his loved ones. His former identity has been taken away. From one perspective, that identity died in the plane crash, and this Max is practically a new identity. But would this happen if we were immortal? This view of identity may be short-sighted if the purpose is to portray it as a negative. Many would welcome a transformation. In fact, transformation cannot be considered death unless we also consider our lives a series of deaths. We are psychologically distinct from who we were when we were infants, for example. Furthermore, the argument against immortality is no comfort to mortals who do not live long enough for such an event to occur. Also, this argument is not without flaws. We don't have to replace our desires, we only have to add to them. The more interests, the less bored we may become. Max's transformation, his new zest for life, has not made his existence more boring. Max seems to believe it's an improvement. In the end, these arguments about whether or not we should fear death might not convince someone who does fear death because these fears are based in our emotions and desires more than simple calculus. If someone is afraid of heights, flying, or both, showing them statistics about the relative safety of air travel may not be enough. Those who fear air travel might move past their phobia through repetition of air travel and showing personal immediate lack of dire consequences, getting on a plane and not dying. However, that can never be done with death. You can't just die a lot to get over a fear of death the way you can just fly on a plane a lot to get over a fear of flying. Due to this, fear of death is unique and therefore uniquely challenging to overcome. Hi everyone, I hope you liked the latest episode. Please click on the Patreon link if you want to support the show, and make sure to click subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.